Good evening. Today's topic is the relative decline of American hegemony and the weakening of the US-led liberal order. Today, we have the honor of welcoming Professor Radhika Desai, a distinguished scholar of international political economy and geopolitics. Professor Desai is widely recognized for her rigorous and critical analysis of global power structures, the evolution of capitalism, and the shifting dynamics of the international order. Her work offers invaluable insight into the changing balance of power and the emergence of a multipolar world. In this interview, we will explore with Professor Desai the relative decline of American hegemony and the reasons behind the weakening of the US-led liberal order, two themes that lie at the center of contemporary geopolitical debates. Professor Desai, my first question is, could you explain the key structural factors that enabled the United States to build its post-war hegemony and how these foundations have eroded over the decades?
Sure. So you see, I should clarify that it is one of the points that I have made in my writing in my book, Geopolitical Economy, that contrary to the belief that the United States is hegemonic or was hegemonic once upon a time, the United States was never hegemonic. It was certainly true that beginning in the early 20th century, the ruling class of the United States basically decided that they would like to replace Britain as the sort of what they call the managing segment, or what one scholar called the managing segment of the world economy. But of course, this was very difficult already by that time, because Britain had dominated the world economy in good part thanks to its very, very large empire, which became even more important as other countries began industrializing, like the United States itself, Germany, and so on. So by the time the United States began to dream about this, began to pursue this ambition, the ability of any single power to dominate the world economy had already become considerably decreased. So it was already impossible. And then the United States said, well, we can't acquire an empire of the size of Britain, but we can make the dollar the world's money. Unfortunately, they also forgot, because that was on the analogy of sterling, and they also forgot that sterling had been the world's money because Britain was an imperial country. Sterling was not a national currency; it was an imperial currency, and it worked. The surpluses extracted from third world countries and exported to Europe and to the European offshoots like Canada, United States, Australia, etc., from the late 19th to the early 20th century were critical to the operation of the sterling system. The US could never do that. The US could never export such capital. So it has, in imposing the dollar on the world economy, it essentially had to resort to providing liquidity by running deficits. And that had a big problem because, as Robert Triffin, the economist, pointed out, the bigger your deficits, the less people want to hold dollars. So the dollar system has never really worked properly. But nevertheless, to answer your question more directly, I would say that the way in which the United States imposed its will on the rest of the world by imposing the dollar, by making sure that it had a overwhelming influence in in at least the IMF and the World Bank, the institutions created, Bretton Woods, and so on. The United States essentially used the temporary power that the wars had given it to impose its will. What do I mean by that? The wars destroyed most of the economies of the world. The wars destroyed the peer economies of the world, but they boosted the US economy. Between 1939 and 1945, the US economy doubled in size. And just to give you an idea of what this meant, it would not double in size again for another 22 years, even though what followed were the so-called golden age of high growth, etc. So in the post-war period, the United States certainly parlayed this temporary dominance into influence, but throughout the post-war period, in fact, its power was not great. Take, for example, the simple fact that the Soviet Union existed. And in order to make sure that Europe would not succumb to the charms of communism, the United States, which would have wished to create a totally open economy, no tariffs, no barriers, etc., very little government role, etc., it had to permit the Europeans a great deal of state intervention in the economy, both vis-a-vis external foreign relations as well as domestic relations, in order that the economies could be stabilized, recoveries could be engineered, and then growth could be engineered. Otherwise, they would lose Europe to perhaps to communism, etc. So these fears actually greatly restricted US power. Same in the Pacific. The United States had to permit Japan and other allied countries like South Korea, etc., considerable amount of leeway. So always exaggerated to say that the US had somehow dominated the world economy. The US had more power in the mid 20th century. It has less power now, but it has not. It was not a transition from something we may call hegemony to lack of hegemony.
Thank you. Next question: the crisis of liberal international order. Many analysts now speak of a deep crisis within the US-led liberal order. In your view, what internal contradictions or policy failures have contributed most to its weakening?
Well, the United States did try to create a liberal order, but like I said, it was never a completely liberal order. So there was considerable amount of state intervention throughout the first 3 or 4 decades of the post-war period, and then beginning in the 80s and the 90s, under neoliberalism and globalization and so on, there was an attempt to create a more liberal world order, and even that is now coming to an end. So why is that? As you say, what are the internal contradictions? So the first and most important contradiction is that, the claim is that a liberal world economy will create growth everywhere. But in reality, a liberal world economy essentially requires all the poor parts of the world to open up their economies. And if they were to open up their economies, they would essentially deny themselves any possibility of development. So what has typically happened is that countries like the Soviet Union in its time, China, even Germany at one point, and the United States have all industrialized, have all developed behind protectionist walls, precisely going against the idea of a liberal world order. And so so essentially what has happened, one thing that has happened is that countries that could industrialize in this fashion did, and that led to a diminution in the dominance of the United States, of the West, and so on. And so in a certain sense, the attempt to create and maintain a world order, and therefore whatever little openness that the US had to engage in order to create the world order, ended up harming the US itself. So that the period since the 1980s, since neoliberalism and globalization, has witnessed a progressive deindustrialization of the United States, a progressive financialization of its economy, such that ordinary people in the United States essentially, their lives were suffering, and the attempt on the part, particularly, on the part of the political establishment, to somehow still try to claim that the US economy was doing very well, obviously fell on deaf ears. The voters were not going to believe that. And so in this context, you got somebody like Trump, who understood that you can't win elections in the United States anymore by saying that the economy is doing very well. So he conceded. He said to the voters, yes, I know you're suffering. But then, of course, since Trump is devoted to serving the same political masters, same capitalist corporate elites as the Bidens or the Obamas of this world and so on, he then accompanied this truth that he told the American people with all sorts of lies. Instead of telling them that the reason why they were suffering was because of neoliberalism, he said to them they were suffering because of trade, they were suffering because of immigrants, and so on. So, but through that, by promising to deal with that, by promising to make America great again, to restore industrial jobs, etc., he has managed to win the election. Of course, nearly a year after winning the elections, and about 10 odd months after his inauguration, what you see is that his strategies of tariffs, etc., are not working. But what I'm trying to say is that the tariffs and the other actions, sanctions and other actions through which the United States is destroying the so-called liberal world order actually come from deep contradictions that the liberal existence of the liberal world order has created in the US economy itself. So this is what has happened. The reason why the US itself is attacking the order that at least it tried to build, it's no longer trying to build that, it's attacking it, is because of what it has cost the US itself.
I just wanted to ask a question related to this, is related to India, because as you know, the United States has imposed really high tariffs on India, and it's kind of astonishing considering that India and the United States had very close relationship in the past, and Modi and Trump were also very close. And so one ponders on what were the reasons why the United States imposed tariffs on India. Was it because India was importing oil from Russia, or was it because of other factors? We hear about the fact that the United States wants India to open up its agriculture and to import American agricultural related products. So do you have extra information about that? What were the reasons behind the imposition of high tariffs?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly it is a puzzling thing, particularly considering that in Modi, he could have asked for no more pro-American prime minister. You know, Modi is extremely pro-American, and Modi represents a ruling class of India that is extremely pro-American. So the only thing so it is puzzling. Now, I think you did name one point that is very important, I think, for the United States, because we forget, you know, when we talk about US dominance and so on, and US industrial power and US technological power, we forget how much the US still depends on agricultural exports. It's a big agriculture exporting economy. So definitely what you are saying is right. And I would add one other thing, which is that you see, there's also the situation where in his zeal to nab the Nobel Peace Prize, he wanted to be portrayed as the person who brought the India and Pakistan, you know, to a ceasefire and to halt their hostilities in the war that broke out briefly back in May and June and so on. So, you know, he made this announcement that he had talked to both sides and brought about peace. And of course, in India, it would simply not do. In the political discourse of no party can admit that somebody else played a role, you know, that somebody else dictated foreign policy to India. So of course, Modi had to deny that. And so since Modi denied that, Trump is definitely, that was part of Trump's calculations in imposing tariffs. We don't know how long they'll stay in place. I believe there is now some talk of Trump visiting India on Modi's invitation. So we'll have to see how the situation develops from here.
Okay, so like what I noticed with Trump is one day he can impose high tariffs and the other day he can change his mind. And
Yes.
like you said, come to India and suddenly be very, very friendly with India and say, oh, I'm not imposing tariffs. But behind that, there would be, I would guess, some kind of negotiation either on the trading of oil or on agriculture. Would you agree with that?
I think that there will be all sorts of negotiations, including, sales of weapons, mutual investments in the two countries. I mean, all sorts of things will be discussed. But I did want to add one other thing that seemed to me quite important. Yes, you said, Trump imposes tariffs, then takes them away. One of the Financial Times journalists coined this expression, TACO. Which is the acronym for the expression. The expression is Trump always chickens out, because he imposes tariffs one day, then he reverses them another day. So there is definitely that one logic. There is also one other logic that you have to bear in mind. Even with the countries that, one of the differences with India, unlike Europe or Canada for that matter, or Japan, India is not reliant on the United States for security. In fact, historically, India's security ties were closer to the Soviet Union and later Russia than to the United States. So certainly, Trump will want India to buy more weapons from India. But there is another thing, that even in the case of countries that are very reliant on the US for security, say Japan, South Korea, or even the EU, he claims to have come with great agreements with all these entities, EU, Japan, South Korea, etc. But actually, there's nothing written down. There is no written agreement. So, and there are still only promises. Japan promises to invest $500 billion in the United States, but that is a promise. It has not yet been fulfilled. God knows how long it will take. Europeans said that they are going to cut tariffs, but I read in the newspapers that the Trump administration is getting more and more impatient with Europe because the tariffs have not been cut, tariffs for American goods going to Europe. So, and the Europeans, of course, they are a big bureaucracy. Everything moves very slowly. And who knows, they're probably also dragging their feet. I don't know. But what I'm saying is that what matters to Trump is the appearance of success. So he always wants, no matter what actually happens on the ground. I mean, look at Gaza. He claims that he has negotiated a ceasefire in Gaza. There is still fighting going on in Gaza. Yeah. Israel is also now attacking Lebanon and whatnot. So so long as he can get away with claims which will at least be believed by somebody, if not everybody, that he is making peace and he's recreating the world order and so on and making America great again, that's all that matters to him. What happens in reality, and in fact what even happens tomorrow after his brief moment of success in claiming that he has done this or that, he doesn't really care. That's my view.
Okay, I'm going to go on to the next question, prospects for the future world order. As American influence becomes relatively less dominant, what kind of global order do you believe is emerging? Do you foresee a cooperative multipolar system or a more fragmented and unstable international environment?
I think, that's a very interesting question. And I think that I personally see that I see a cooperative multipolar world order emerging. But I say multipolar, but I also would like to underline that I think China is playing a leading role in this. And it will not be, it's not like China will replace the US as the hegemonic power. As I said, the US was already found it very difficult to be the hegemonic power in a world that was already very multipolar at that time. Remember, during the Cold War, we referred to bipolarity. So it was not any kind of unipolarity. The unipolar moment didn't last very long. So we live in a multipolar world, but still China will punch above its weight in this world because China is a highly successful economy. And although people often put China and India in the same bracket, in the same sentence, they talk about it in the same breath, there is absolutely no comparison. In reality, India's growth rate is highly exaggerated by certain statistical changes that have taken place in the way in which India's GDP is measured. And so if you account for those changes, India's growth rate is extremely mediocre. And even then, it is based on some very dodgy statistics. In reality, like in the United States, in India also, there is a K-shaped economy. Those who are a small number of people who are very rich, they are doing very well. The overwhelming majority of people are suffering. So in this context, and there are no other comparisons comparable powers. So China will always remain important. Now, I'm also emphasizing China because today, alongside Russia, China is also playing a leading role in trying to create economic governance institutions and mechanisms, including, some sort of mechanisms to replace the dollar, at least in trade and investment relations, productive investment relations. So these countries are trying to create a multipolar world order. So the other thing that follows from this is that, today we seem to be, of course, we are living in a very turbulent world, but all the turbulence is emanating from the US and from, more generally, from the North Atlantic. The rest of the world is actually, by relatively speaking, an oasis or an ocean of stability. Yeah, it's very, and in fact, that is what is emerging. I think what's going to happen as a result of the kind of policies that Trump is following, in order to show the American people, in order to create this sham appearance that he's addressing the concerns of the American people, the path that he's following is going to make the United States even less relevant to the world economy than it has already become. Let me just take one statistic. Trump's tariffs are, the fact that he is forced to go back and forth on them, imposing them one day, withdrawing them another day. The fact that this is happening has to do with the simple fact that the weight of the US in world trade is not so high. The US already has a trade deficit, so it imports more than it exports. But the proportion of the US share of total world imports is about 13%. It's still the largest importer in the world, but at 13%, the rest of the world can, it will suffer to some extent because of the tariffs, but it will soon reorient its trade away from the United States. And that means that the US share of world trade will decline even more. So I think that if the situation in the US does not radically improve with some some political force much more capable of dealing with the US's problems, which are very deep and very multifaceted. If such a political force does not come to power, I would say that the US's decline will continue. It will continue to wreak turbulence on the world, but the effect of that turbulence will diminish. Its power to impose this turbulence will diminish. So in this context, I think that China, Russia, perhaps to some extent, at least the rest of the BRICS, etc., they are trying to create a different type of world order. The real question as to whether such a world order will emerge and how soon it will emerge will depend on how other countries will behave. So, for example, I've already said that India, the ruling elites in India, the current government in India is very pro-American. So, when will they learn that there is not much to be gained from having close relations with the United States? The same goes for elites in countries like South Africa, Brazil, and other systemically important countries, many other systemically important countries. When will they break with the United States? This will determine the pace of the emergence of a multipolar world order, but that it must emerge is definite. The only question is how soon and with how much collateral damage that can be imposed by the US and other such powers.
In this multipolar world, future world, where we see the emergence of the global south and we see the emergence of China and Russia, notably, would you say that in the decline of the United States, there would also be the decline of the EU as well? The European countries?
That's a very important question. Yeah. So I would say that the EU, at the moment, it is it's taking a very peculiar path. The current governments in the EU, not all of them, but certainly most of them, all the major countries, they are pursuing a anti-Russian line. They seem to be more committed to the war in Ukraine than the United States. And this is directly leading to their own economic decline. And I would say that what's happening is that since the early part of this century, so since about 2000, since the launching of the euro, it seems to me that the European elites had become committed to a project of making the EU not only more like the United States, a more financialized economy, etc., but also closer to the United States than it had ever been. You know, it had made some effort in the past to pursue an independent foreign policy, but these elites, they have also some very close personal ties with the United States and so on. So these elites seem to be committed to this path, and so even though Trump seems to be, Trump seems to want to loosen the ties between the United States and Europe. These people are clinging to it, and I would say that these elites are the elites who represent an exhausted project. This project is over, and that's why they don't know which way to turn. I mean, the United States has left them holding the bag vis-a-vis Ukraine. But the fact of the matter is that they do not have the fiscal capacity or the political capacity to continue the war in Ukraine, which is deeply unpopular among ordinary Europeans. So I would say that in the coming in coming years and maybe a decade or so, I suspect that you will see very considerable changes in Europe occurring, where finally, when elections arrive and these governments are thrown out of power, one hopes that new forces come to power in Europe, which are capable of saying, first and foremost, Europe cannot have a secure and prosperous future if it makes an enemy of Russia. And I think if this point becomes the point of departure, and Europe can become a very important and can benefit from taking part in a multipolar world order in which it will have a place, but it will not be a dominant place.
Okay, thank you. I'll go on to the. Okay, I will conclude. Professor Radhika Desai, thank you for sharing your deep and thoughtful analysis on the crucial global issues. Your insights helped us better understand the structural shifts taking place in the international system and the forces shaping the transition towards a more multipolar world. We are grateful for your time and expertise, and we look forward to continuing to learn from your work in the future. Thank you very much, Professor Desai. It was very interesting to talk to you about the international world order and how it is changing. And I hope we will have a further discussion with you on other topics. Thank you very much, and have a good evening.
Yeah, thank you very much. I look forward to it too.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.